if she wants to carry it off from being there with her. I think we need to get rid of it. It needs to be revisited, and if we have to take it apart section at a time.
I didn't.
Right.
Wasn't listening.
Right. Well, I mean, how many billion are we spending over the past 10 years? Let's see, how long has it been there? 2001?
18 years it's costing this thing.
I'm just always related to feet don't swing on
The property values.
It actually comes up here.
Hi, how are you? Donna Campbell.
Everyone else's feet on the ground and mine.
Oh, your feet don't touch the ground?
Yeah, no, they do. It's nice.
Oh.
They often don't.
You don't want to lean back though very far. No.
I know I keep praying God will make me taller, but that hasn't happened yet. I keep getting shorter.
I keep getting fatter.
Yeah.
Boy, is that a bright.
Do I need to turn this on?
No, they turn it on back there.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Bill Peacock with the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and we're all glad that you're here to join us this morning here in the auditorium and live streaming. We're here to talk about an issue that is getting more and more coverage and discussion here in Texas, and that is renewable energy subsidies. Since the creation of the world, mankind has been looking for ways, sources of energy outside of our own bodies to build up the world and feed ourselves, and we just can't do it on our own. Early examples of that, of course, are beasts of burden, oxen and horses and cows and those kinds of things that can do work that we can't do ourselves. But from almost the very beginning as well, renewable energy has been the main provider of energy. Wind and solar and water and biomass, otherwise known as wood, have powered the growth of our society and civilization, and have been the primary provider, as I said. The first change really in that came about in the 1200s when coal started coming on the grid, if you will, to keep people warm, particularly in England. Right? And there was a big battle there. Consumers, the public, wanted coal because it was a lot cheaper and a lot more efficient than wood. Plus, the king wasn't letting them get to the wood very often in the king's woods. But there was the royalty didn't really care so much about the consumers. They wanted to burn biomass. They wanted to burn biomass rather than coal. And so they even outlawed coal at a time. And that battle has continued on until today. The first, oil and natural gas, coal, later nuclear, when they came online and proved, and we had the technology and the capital to make use of them, quickly surpassed renewable energies technology. A lot of times we hear that renewable energy just needs a chance to get caught up, but really it's the oldest technology. The first wind turbine, if you will, windmill that tried to produce electricity was back in the late 1800s. There's just a problem out there that wind and solar in particular are just not efficient. And I've got a couple of slides here to make that case for us. Here, Texas had a very hot summer, and we again set a record for load electricity used here in Texas this past summer. And here's a graph of the load. That's the line across the top. The load or the demand for electricity, the amount of electricity we used, versus the amount of solar, which is the bottom line, and wind, which is the line in between a little bit. And you can see that when demand peaked, when we needed the most electricity, which is typically between about 4 and 6 o'clock in the afternoon on those July and August afternoons, wind was not at its lowest production, but it was pretty low. Of course, the sun is producing more solar power at that time, but it's very minuscule. So really, when we needed energy most, wind and solar aren't there to provide for us. And we see an example of that here. You can see the The red is the amount of electricity that we provide from other sources besides wind. And the blue is the purple is what we use from wind. That pink area in the middle, that's the capacity of wind that didn't show up in those peak hours. Right? And you can see again, there's an example why wind doesn't show up. Now, there's nothing wrong with renewable energy. If it's a technology that works, people should use it. The challenge is that we are forcing consumers and taxpayers to subsidize those generally inefficient sources of energy. And so we're getting not very much for a lot of money, and you can see some of the cost here. U.S. taxpayers, over the course of the production tax credit, since 2008 and through the current expiration date of that in 2029, will be paying about $65 billion in subsidies to major multinational corporations with multi-billion-dollar market caps. Texas ratepayers are paying over more than $7 billion to pay for transmission out to West Texas to bring wind energy, and particularly to market here. Texas property taxpayers have paid up to $1.8 billion in tax abatements, not cash outlays, but in tax abatements. And then there's untold billions of dollars worth of costs that require backup generation for wind, because the wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine, and when those stop, then you have to have backup generation, and that costs money all the time. So that's kind of the big issue that we're going to have here, the discussion we're going to have here today. Before we get to our panelists, we've got a video that we want to show you that kind of demonstrates a little bit about the challenges of reliability when it comes to wind energy. Wrong with using renewable energy. There are places for it in the Northwest. Water makes perfect sense. In places where there's not a large grid, solar can make a lot of sense, so can wind. But that really needs to be left up to the market. And that's not happening with all the subsidies today. So we have an expert panel here who can talk about these issues and examine when and where and how we might use wind and solar and other renewables, and also the cost, though, of these subsidies to us. We're going to start today with, we're going to have our panels, and we'll be having them sit down. But our first panelist I'd like to introduce is the Honorable Kathleen Hartnett-White. Kathleen joined the Texas Public Policy Foundation in 2008, is one of my co-workers, has been here, a co-worker with me during that time. Prior to joining the foundation, she was the chairman and the commissioner of the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, which is Texas's EPA, if you will. It's the second largest environmental protection regulatory agency in the entire world. Her writing has appeared in publications across the country, including National Review, Investors Business Daily. She's testified before the U.S. Senate Environmental and Public Works Committee, and she's written her own book, which I have a copy of right here, and she does too. Fueling Freedom, Exposing the Mad War on Energy, co-written with Stephen Moore. So would you join me in welcoming Kathleen? Yeah, you're good. Our second speaker is Dr. Peter Hartley. Dr. Hartley is a Rice Scholar of Energy Economics at the Baker Institute at Rice University. He has worked on energy economics for 35 years, focusing on electricity, but also worked on natural gas and oil, coal, nuclear, and renewable energy. He's been published in many other areas as well, including money and banking, business cycles, and international finance. And he's received his PhD from the University of Chicago and was an assistant professor at economics at Princeton before coming to Rice, and has also held visiting appointments at Melbourne University, Australian National University, and the University of Western Australia. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hartley. Our third panelist today is the Honorable Mark McBride. Mark is a businessman and a community leader in Oklahoma who seeks to help people and get results both in his public and in his personal life. He was elected to the Oklahoma House of Representatives in 2012. In his first term, he served as the vice chair of the House Utility Environmental Regulation Committee and also on the House Judiciary Committee. He currently serves on the board of directors for the Center for Legislative Energy and Environmental Research and will be beginning his second term as the vice chairman of the House Energy Committee. Please join me in welcoming Mark. And our final panelist today is the Honorable Donna Campbell. Donna is a board-certified emergency room physician and also a proud parent of 4 daughters. She lives in New Braunfels and represents Senate District 25 in the Texas Senate, which is a 6-county district, including parts of San Antonio and Austin, where we live here. Unfortunately, she's not my senator.
Thank you for that.
Sure. She currently serves as the chairman of the Senate Veteran Affairs and Border Security Committee. During the 85th legislation, she authored or sponsored over 109 pieces of legislation, 53 of those which made it to the governor's desk on their way to becoming law. And she also is a member of several committees, including Senate Finance and Business and Commerce, and truly a champion for liberty in the Texas legislature. So please join me in welcoming Donna Campbell. All right, so we're just going to have a conversational style, no presentations, but we have a lot of information to get out, so we're going to begin with that. So I'd like to begin asking you, Kathleen, just a question. So you've worked as a chairman for the TCQ here in Texas and at the foundation, and you've seen firsthand the debate over renewable energy and renewable energy subsidies, and here in Texas. But you've also done a lot of research around the world and seen these things on a global scale. And sometimes when we're here in one place, we kind of miss that global perspective. Could you give us some ideas about some of the challenges that you've encountered with renewables out there in places like Germany or Spain or England, those kind of places, and explain how that might help inform the debate here?
I'd be glad to, and I would begin as Bill Peacock began, that renewable energies can play a very, very important role in all kinds of diverse ways. But now, it is the sort of general policy that you need to get as much wind and solar infrastructure out as you can, keep it going, keep it going, keep it going. And there's, if there is a policy, it's not one directly articulated by the federal or the state government, but there's lots of things about what's actually going out there in the renewable world that has rarely had some light thrown on it. Germany And the UK, I've spent more time trying to stay in touch with what is going on in those two countries. They have, before the United States had any specific policy, which would be the case for us, whatever rule EPA decided to adopt, regardless of its questionable authority under anything called law. But just to jump to the chase, I think it's so important to look particularly at Europe and Australia as subject matter that can really inform us. They're farther ahead on very, very elaborate, bold, where the idea is not to just have a modest percentage of electricity generated by renewables, but at scale, at least in all our major cities and the metropolitan areas, and actually for the entire population of the state or this country. The things that concern me, things may have changed a little bit in the last year, but in Germany, you could read articles in one of their major periodicals called Der Spiegel, how electricity became a luxury good in Germany. And that was when retail electric rates in Germany were 2 to 3 times higher than they are here. You don't hear that discussed very much. I don't know about the people in this room, but I really don't think I could stay in my home if my electric bill was 3 times higher than it is now. It would just be beyond my means. The other thing that comes to light, and I think it's characteristic of the UK, Germany, and Australia, maybe a few other countries, is that the more renewable infrastructure that is deployed, the more you have to have backup that is reliable, that can keep the grid integrated and working. And I won't go on because we're all going to talk about it, but those things are certainly lessons we can learn that you don't hear much discussion of. What also you don't hear very much about, and as a former environmental regulator, one which thinks conservative policy principles are actually a better way to protect the environment. There's lots of things you don't get. There's the amount of just, acres of land in this country it would take. We're already 40%, I believe, of the corn crop, I think, is already going to ethanol. But anyway, just the fingerprint, if you will, of the renewable universe is vast and very rarely admitted. Also, it seems so clean, these renewable facilities, but the amount, some energy economist has calculated the amount of steel and the amount of concrete needed to support one wind turbine, and it too is vast. I'm not going to use all kinds of numbers, but far more than, say, a power plant of comparable capacity, as well as, anyway. The other thing is there's lots that's not so clean at all about the wind and solar infrastructure, including the use of a variety of materials, sometimes called rare earth metals, that are really heavy-duty toxic type pollutants. They are also produced in some of the most wrecked countries in the world, with nothing even vaguely representing environmental protection. And then, of course, all of the energy costs of energy. And this is the clincher, and we'll turn the discussion over to the group. What would you guess was the the biggest share of the renewable portfolio of the European Union? What would be the energy? It's woody biomass, otherwise known as wood, and we, if you are not aware of this, we produce a substantial amount of the growing international trade in little wood pellets that are being used in power plants. And they are, besides just burning wood is a reason why the Industrial Revolution was in part so amazing, to get away from that renewable fuel that is wood. And we subsidize also. Wood is recognized in the climate conventions as carbon neutral, and I won't go into the detail why, but it's something about claims of you burn a tree, you plant a tree, which sounds good, but the arithmetic doesn't work out very well. But so we're 65% of the European Union renewable portfolio is from woody biomass. From the last numbers I saw, about 40% of the UK's renewable portfolio. And we are sending wood from the United States, transformed into neat and tidy little pellets, which I think comically in little plastic bags that we're supposed to not use anymore. But that's a lunacy. At least there's lots of academic papers on this, but burning good wood, dry wood, it probably releases 4 to 6 times more genuine pollutants that can impair human health. And yet we subsidize that. I mean, this is something is really amiss. And just, I believe last week, and then I will conclude, just last week in one of the assessments by the U.S. Energy Information Administration, it concludes that currently more CO2 accidentally or inadvertently was reduced by the United States than any other country in the world, and actually that the European Union countries, particularly those, not just the Eastern European, but the Western European, have increased slightly their emissions of CO2 and genuine pollutants that indeed can impact human health in a way CO2 does not. So something's really amiss. Somehow I think to learn the lessons from foreign countries and to really shine some sunlight on something as bizarre as subsidizing wood to abate global warming. But I lift that up to my colleagues, and thank you all.
All right. Peter, as if our audience doesn't already know it, in about 30 seconds, they'll discover that you originally hail from Australia. And that country at one point had some of the most competitive electricity markets in the world. But as you pointed out, the policymakers couldn't leave well enough alone, and caused a lot of problems there. So could you talk about some of the problems that you've seen? But you've also done a lot of research here in Texas and looked at the Texas market. Could you talk a little bit about the challenges that the renewable energy subsidies in particular, or mandates, those kind of things that have caused in Australia, here in Texas generally?
So, I mean, some of the issues, you already covered in your introduction. But my first comment is I wrote a paper, gave a presentation last year in Australia on cheap resources into expensive energy. And, the basic idea is, any politician probably could mess up Italy, but it takes a real genius to introduce policy to make energy expensive in Australia. So, I mean, so up until about 2007, Australia had indeed some of the cheapest, if not, amongst the cheapest electricity in the world. Absolutely fantastic result. Australia is still the biggest exporter of coal in the world. Sometimes Indonesia is number one, but either number one or number two. They have coal resources in the state of Victoria, 10 metres of overburden, 100 metres of coal. And you can just, you go to the power station, you dig it out, put it into the power station. Incredibly cheap electricity, but the government there, the geniuses, are closing down the coal plants. No new coal plants are being built in Australia. The existing ones are being shut. And since 2007, we had this big renewable energy mandates, and electricity prices have gone through the roof. And same kind of thing in Europe. I've done a study of countries in the EU, 23 countries. You find very strong statistical regularity. The more wind, the more solar they have. They have to have more gas turbine backup, actually. I'll mention that in a moment. The higher the price of electricity. Systematic effect, same thing. So the question is, why is it that around the world, everywhere it's been tried, you find renewable energy mandates result in much more expensive electricity? And the basic problem is that the system-wide effects that you've got to take into account, first of all. And as was mentioned, the renewable power is not what economists call, or engineers call, dispatchable. You've got to take the power when it's generated, and when you want the power, you can't order the wind to blow or the sun to shine. So you have to have backup capacity. So you are more or less doubling the capital that's required. And so that adds to an enormous expense. You've got to have the capital for the renewables and for the backup. And then when the renewables are generating, they're taking revenue away from the backup capacity, which means that capital is used much less efficiently. So the costs go up for that reason as well. Another point is that was mentioned with your wind stopping the turbine from spinning. The fact is that wind in particular is very intermittent. So the physics are that basically if the wind blows too strong, you've got to turn the wind generator off, otherwise it gets damaged. If the wind doesn't blow strong enough, you don't get any power from it. But over the range where it's mainly generating, the power production goes as the cube of the wind speed. So you change the wind speed from 10 metres a second to 11 metres per second. That's a 10% change in wind speed. Changes the power output by 30%, basically. So that's why you imagine, if you have the little propeller on a stick and you blow a little bit harder, and right? So you get much more power, much more production. So it's very highly variable, and you have to have that means it creates lots of problems. You're having to cope with that variability. You have to have alternative capacity ready to go, quick start capacity. In Australia, we had two famous examples in the state of South Australia over the last maybe 15 months, where the entire state went black twice. There they decided they wanted to lead the world in renewable energy. 40%, they want 40% from renewables. We had one episode where the wind blew too strong, and all the wind generators went off the system, bang, like that. You couldn't control frequency. The interstate connectors were shut down to prevent from damage. Whole state went black. People were caught in elevators, people at home on medical assist devices, power cut off, all the traffic lights go out. I mean, the modern society relies, as your videos mentioned, tremendously on electricity. It is very, very expensive. Very, very expensive to have the electricity disappear all of a sudden. The other episode, so that was one where the wind was blowing too strong. The other one was where the wind was not blowing strong enough. All of a sudden, wind dropped, the wind generators fell off the system, blackout. So this intermittency is a very significant problem. Another reason that having to cope with that is one thing that makes the electricity much more expensive when you have a lot of this capacity on the system. Another factor is that the capacity factor of these kind of generators is not that high. So, here in Texas, Texas is blessed in many ways with fossil fuels, but also actually Texas is one of the best places in the world to generate wind energy, it turns out. The capacity factor here may be 35%. In other words, you have a wind farm has a certain ability to generate electricity. The amount of electricity it generates over the year is about 35% of what it could theoretically generate if the wind were blowing at the optimal speed all the time. But even that is not that high compared with a lot of other forms of generation, and solar is even less. And in places like in Europe, you're lucky, on average, the capacity factor is about 20%. So what that means is that you have a lot of capital expense, you don't get a whole lot of electricity from it. Another thing is that a lot of times the wind generation is quite remote. So we all know here in Texas we have to build the CREZ lines. These are quite expensive. The cost of the CREZ line, about $7 billion, was loaded onto everyone's power bill. But those lines, because the wind generators only work at about 35%, the lines only work at about 35%. You could have put nuclear power plants at the end of those same lines. They would have been used 24/7 and 100% capacity, much, much more efficiently than only using the 35% or 30%. Same thing with solar. One big problem with solar, particularly rooftop solar, is that you're putting generating capacity now in the low voltage part of the network. Well, the whole network has been engineered to flow power from the high voltage part down to the low voltage part. If you start to put generation capacity in the low voltage part of the network, you have to re-engineer the network, which adds a lot to the network cost. So you've got long distance transmission lines, having to re-engineer the network to cope with solar. And the final thing, I guess I probably get saying too much, but one last thing I will say, if I can, is that Another problem you have in a lot of these countries, and it's been a really big problem in Australia, is that it's sort of interesting. You notice where's most of the solar being installed? It's being installed on a rooftop. Why is that? And the reason basically is that the retail price of electricity reflects capital costs as well as operating costs. All a solar panel really does for you is save on operating costs. So when the sun's shining, you don't have to burn the gas or the coal or whatever. But the retail price, a big part of it is the capital cost of running the network and so on. So every hour that you're not taking power from the system, you're avoiding fixed costs. But in reality, from the point of view of the system as a whole, those fixed costs still have to be incurred. So there is an implicit subsidy. It's not just all the explicit subsidies we're talking about. There's actually also an enormous implicit subsidy to solar power that's built into the way we price electricity. I can explain that in more detail later. I won't want to monopolise the floor now. Maybe we want to come back to that. So I'll give someone else a go.
Great, okay. We'll step back from Europe and Australia and come back a little closer to home, just across the Red River. Mark, y'all are having a debate very similar to what we're having down here in Texas, just about the cost that renewable energy imposes on consumers and taxpayers, and you've done a lot of work on that. Could you give us a little bit of background about how that debate is shaping up in Oklahoma and what you've discovered in your research and efforts?
Well, you bet. You know, first off, let's clarify, I'm not an expert or am I published. So I was at an awards deal at Oklahoma State University here a while back, and I was sitting with a few professors at this table, and they asked me, Dr. McBride, what's your expertise or what's your degree in? And I told them, I said, well, cowboy medicine and shovel. But, you know, this whole issue with renewable energy, I think, is a common sense issue. It's an add and subtract issue. It's really easy to look at, for me, for what it's cost in Oklahoma. When you look at the jobs that they produce, I mean, just last week, the Department of Commerce gave me a number of 179 retained jobs and 45 lobbyists. So oil and gas, you know, the only comparison I really have to use in Oklahoma is oil and gas, and you know, where they have 148,000 full-time jobs, direct jobs. And the big deal in Oklahoma, you know, I've tried not to make this about fossil fuels or renewables, but it's difficult because they continue to come back and beat up on fossil fuels and make it sound like that we can be 100% renewable, where that's total fictitious. It'll never happen. I mean, there's just no possible way that that's ever happening. But they talk about big oil and wind. Well, if you look at the top 10 renewable companies that are operating, building wind turbines in Oklahoma, their market cap is $533 billion. You take the top 20 oil producers in Oklahoma, their market cap is $346 billion. And 18 of those companies have corporate offices in Oklahoma, where these wind companies only have one small satellite company that employs 3 people. So, you know, the taxes that are paid, you know, oil and gas pays about $1.3 billion in taxes a year in Oklahoma, where at the end of the day, after you take away their subsidies, their ad valorem reimbursements and everything, wind only pays like $7.6 million a year in taxes. So the cost to the state is great. You know, we're a state that's had, in the last 5 years, anywhere from $300 million to $1.3 billion shortfall. We've cut agencies. We've just cut people across the board. We've taken hundreds of millions of dollars of oil and gas subsidies away from them. Last year, we increased gross production tax in Oklahoma by 150%. And in all of that, renewable energy has never come to the table and agreed for a similar type gross production tax. My deal, I was pushing $1 a megawatt hour, which equals about 30 million, maybe $40 million. They weren't willing to do that. We wanted to do away with the refundability that costs us about $80 million a year over the next 9 years. They wouldn't, they fought that. And part of that is the fault of the legislature, that we could not get those things through. I mean, they've convinced people in the legislature that this is the way, that we're going to be 100% renewable. I don't know if it's the cash they're spinning around. I know in some of the races, they spent about $180,000 just in some primary races to get a few people beat, So, and then we go into we've got a wind company going in, putting up a new wind farm around one of our towns. They've had a cease and desist letter from the Attorney General. It's right in the flight pattern of Shepherd Air Force Base and Altus Air Force Base. It would be horrible for us or Texas to lose either one of those. And then just today, a reporter friend of mine, Trace Savage with NonDoc, sent me this article that went out this morning. Counties reject wind farm exemptions, lawsuit filed. So these are two counties that have like 4,500 people in them. And these wind farms don't want to pay ad valorem tax, which the ad valorem tax is what you're going to build a new gym with. I mean, these are small rural schools. And I just, and there's some personal issues that I have along, but they're not good actors. They're more worried about their investors, and I realize that you have to be worried about investment, oil and gas. Everybody's worried about your investors, but this is all about investors that are at least 40% foreign owned. Their offices are about 40% out of the country, and they really don't care about Oklahoma, and I doubt very seriously that they really care about Texas and where you're headed. So.
You're exactly right.
Well, right along those lines, Senator Campbell, in 2017, you passed legislation that prohibited wind farms from getting tax abatements, 312 and 313 tax abatements within 25 nautical miles of an air base. And some people try to make that a wind issue, but I know for you and for Representative Frank, that was really about protecting our bases from the closure process. But you've learned a lot about wind over the years here. Are there issues that are concerning you about the role of wind and the role of local subsidies and other kinds of abatements and the effects of those on taxpayers and consumers?
Excuse me. Well, first of all, thank you for having us up here as a panel. I think this is really important. It's a great day and love seeing everybody here. Well, let me start out, and I will get to your questions, specifics, but how many are you happy with having your freedom and having, an interest in protecting our national security? Raise your hand. Right. So for me, leading into Representative McBride's comments, my interest in all personal opinions aside, my interest in what we did with Senate Bill 277 was all about our national security. So let me paint from that broad brush strokes that I've just done, and how do I get to that? When you look at, and let me also preface by saying, I like wind energy. What I don't like is wind subsidy. So now let's back up. When you look at the encroachment that the wind turbines were having around our military aviation bases, when you take the height, where they're sited, you couple that with the radar degradation that the wind turbines cause, and it affects the flight path, safety of our pilots. It affects the mission. Now, let's get some perspective of a mission. Naval Air Station Kingsville, down there by Corpus, Kingsville, trains 1/2 of all Navy and Marine Corps pilots. Now, if something threatens that base, those pilots don't get trained there. If their mission is cut by half, those missions have to be taken elsewhere. Mississippi, not Texas. Now hold that thought as I just jump to the economy. Our military installations provide $140 billion to our economy, 900,000 both direct and indirect jobs. So first of all, do we want to lose any part of our military installations? No. But now let's go back to our security and having Mississippi take over our training of our pilots. No, we don't want that. But the wind blows out in Corpus. So the wind turbine industry was out there getting so close that it does threaten the mission. And as Bill was saying, with BRAC, our base realignment, trying to figure out something else to do with our bases, and closure, which the Department of Defense is responsible for taking a look at. Do we still need all these bases? We don't need anything threatening our missions. And anybody who says, well, I've been in the military and we didn't see a threat, let me tell you, you can check with any base commander on an aviation base and they will tell you it is a real threat. So what it took for us, we couldn't wait on the federal government. And what it took for us to do was have Senate Bill 277 come through and just say, hey, you can put your wind farm there. Didn't like that option. I didn't. But we're going to take away your subsidy. Now, some of them have stopped coming, right? And so the encroachment hopefully has stopped. But I must say, there is a foreign company that's looking to put one in thinking, well, they don't care about the state subsidy. They'll just take the federal subsidy. So this is more than just a state problem. This is a nationwide problem. But at least what we were able to do was take that abatement, that 313 abatement, and for 25 nautical miles, able to just say, no, not in our backyard, right? So that's what that bill was about. Going forward, again, wind energy is fine. It is not reliable. Yeah, it's renewable, but it's not reliable. They don't have to stand up to the market dynamics that other private industry does, as you pointed out. So the subsidies for wind energy need to be withdrawn and allow them to stand on their own with the market forces that everybody else has to stand on. I think that probably answers it. If not, and if you can't tell, I'm very protective of our bases, as I'm sure everybody here would be.
Following up on that question for anybody on the panel, a lot of times we hear from renewable energy companies or supporters of renewable energy that, well, you're talking about renewable energy subsidies, but what about subsidies for everybody else, for oil and gas and for other people? And at the foundation, our answer is well, we're opposed to all subsidies. We don't want any of that at all. Do y'all have any thoughts about the, in the Texas legislature on subsidies for all, Oklahoma? Mark, you've done some studies up there. I mean, is it really true that other industries are getting more subsidies than renewable?
Not in Oklahoma. Renewable they get the largest subsidies in the state. I mean, I agree. I'm not totally against subsidies. I think there needs to be a sunset. We could do some things, but the sunset needs to be pretty quick. A business model, if you can't make it in 3 or 5 years, you just need to shut the doors and go down the road. That's what your banker would tell you. And I think that's the way it should be on any kind of subsidies that we're giving out. But yeah, Oklahoma, they'd like more. Solar last year, they were trying to do some solar stuff, and some state subsidies, and we're not going to go down that road. This put a pretty bad taste in my mouth. I mean, and in a lot of legislators' mouth, and a lot of the public. But we'll see, how the people respond.
Yeah. And I would add to that and say, let's look at what 313s are. So 313 was created by the legislators because they felt back then, 2001, that they needed some kind of incentive to bring businesses, workers into Texas and have an economy. Well, now Texas is like the number one number one job creation in Texas. In the nation. So we need to revisit why Chapter 313's started. And when you look at it, not only is wind energy not reliable, they get their 313s, they get their abatements, and they're not job creators. The purpose, out in the rural counties, I think they were at least supposed to create 8 to 10 jobs. Well, they don't.
Yep.
The manufacturing companies come here. They have over 90% of the jobs created by these abatements. Wind energy, 50% of the projects that abatements are assigned to create less than 10% of the jobs. Wind energy the wind farms have 50% of the projects, create 10% of the jobs. Manufacturing creates 90% of the jobs. So they are not job creators. So why are we giving a job creation abatement to a non-job creating industry? Needs to be rethought.
So do y'all have a sales tax exemption as well
For
the turbines and all that?
They get the depreciation. I don't know. Do we? I don't think so.
We have a
But I
sales
don't know
tax
that we-
exemption.
Right.
My comment I was going to make is that apart from explicit subsidies, when we're talking about explicit subsidies, there are these implicit subsidies as well. So, a mandate that the utilities have to buy a certain percentage of their electricity from renewable sources is actually an implicit subsidy. How do we pay for it? We don't pay for it through explicit tax. All the consumers of electricity pay for it because the price of electricity has to be higher in order to pay for the renewable, whatever's counted as renewable, varies state by state. But in order to pay for the renewable energy, which wouldn't be bought otherwise because it's more expensive. The utilities wouldn't have chosen to generate electricity that way. But by putting on a mandate, it's an extra implicit subsidy. And then my solar example was the other one. The fact that you've got the electricity price doesn't really reflect the fixed costs, like I was saying. The electricity price includes the fixed cost as well as the variable cost, but all the solar panel savings is on variable cost, means that there's extra kind of implicit subsidy built into the pricing mechanism. So there are all of these extra subsidies as well, not just the explicit ones.
And I think this follows with everything's been stated. There's different ways to define a subsidy and also different metrics to use and all of that. And it's been drawn to my attention that in this dispute between renewables and fossil fuels, as far as subsidies, I think a significant part of that attributed to the fossil fuels is just normal depreciation sort of things. It's based on your income. It's not. And there are, I think, our federal number crunchers in the Energy Information Administration, so I think should really take a good look at the methodologies they use because they are a big part of the issue.
And I would follow up just one additional thing when we're talking about our fossil fuels. When you look at oil and gas, they are paying a severance tax, not the wind energy. They pay a severance tax. Where does that severance tax go? 25% goes straight to education. Where does the abatement come from for the wind energy? It's taken out of education. Something's wrong with that picture. We need to fix it.
One comment I was going to follow again too on what you both of you said about jobs. We did a study in the state of Texas on looking at jobs coming from oil and gas and from wind, and we looked at county by county, looked at all the jobs. So it included, people working in restaurants and motels and the whole thing as well. And we found that, adding up all the kinds of jobs that you had a spillover effect in neighbouring counties as well, but roughly speaking, from memory, we had something like 250, 300 jobs per well drilled overall from oil and gas. But when you looked at the wind farms, we couldn't find any actually jobs. And I'm not sure what, I'm not sure, we tried very hard. I'm not sure exactly what the problem was. One hypothesis is that, you know, if you drive up the cost of electricity or something like that, it may actually drive other jobs away. So, I mean, obviously it takes people to install a wind farm. So we should have found some jobs, but statistically speaking, we couldn't find any employment impact effects at all.
And yet they get a waiver. The wind farms can get a waiver for, I mean, because there's a condition to get your abatement that you've got to create X number of jobs, say 10. But if they can't get, if they don't have that many jobs they're going to create, they can actually get a waiver so they don't have to do it. So why are they getting the abatement?
Yeah, there's a lot of cost when it comes to these subsidies for renewable energies. And one of the biggest costs that we've noticed, because we've been traveling around the state, going to places like Henrietta and Brownwood and Comanche and just all over the state, and talking to people who have living with turbines in their backyards or near their backyards, or the prospect of those coming in. So we've got a video that we shot in Comanche that we'd like to share with the audience now about the human cost of some of these subsidies.
Some people I've heard describe it as an airplane or jet plane that never lands.
For us, if the wind's out of the north, they roar.
That's something that you go to the country for. A lot of people in the city go to the country for that. And that's something we've enjoyed living in the country, is it's peaceful, it's quiet, it's serene. It's no longer like that here.
The wind was horrible, and it sounded like one of them was making even a different noise than normal. It was squealing. It was just horrific. I'm here by myself for a while, and I sat there and I just screamed. You know, you've got the window blinds shut, you've got the curtains pulled too, and it's just nonstop.
At night is especially can be really hard when you try to go to sleep at night and you hear the roar of the wind turbines.
They reflect off our windshields, off my garage door, my fireplace screen, which is in the middle of a interior wall. We can't eat on either side of the bar or the table without seeing spinning blades or blinking red lights, depending on the time of day.
I see these advertisements on television and they have windmills in the background, and people think, oh, they're so pretty. Well, they're not pretty to us when we're surrounded by them.
I'm exhausted. We stay that way. You don't rest good at night. You work hard during the day, and that's strictly because of the turbines.
If we knew how much money they were making, maybe we could understand a little bit about why it's so important to them.
There are two things on subsidies, and one is the production tax credit. The other subsidy is the local school districts and local government, county and hospital districts give tax relief the first few years.
My hope is that all of the subsidies are gone, because if the subsidies go away, these will not be profitable and the wind turbines will go away. They're not making money off the electricity, they're making money off of what the government is giving them. The wind towers are not about the wind. They're about the money.
You know, there are two things that really stand out for me as as we've worked on this issue and gone out to talk to these folks. One is the clarity you get on issues of public policy once you get outside of places like Austin and Oklahoma City and Washington, D.C. I mean, it becomes, you know, it gets very convoluted here because people want to make it that way. But you get out and talk to folks like this, the impact of what goes on in a lot of places, it becomes a lot more clear. The second thing is, you know, one of the challenges with the subsidies here in Texas is that the 312 and 313 in particular is there's almost no transparency about it. The first thing that these folks up in Comanche knew, most of them knew about wind turbines coming in, literally almost in their backyard, was when the trucks started coming down the road to start the cement plant, because you have to put tons and tons of concrete in the ground to hold these turbines up. They didn't know it was coming because what happens is 312 and 313 are both exempted from the Texas Open Meetings Act and the Texas Public Information Act. And at most, they get 72 hours notice on a bulletin board in a county courthouse, on a paper, back in the paper that nobody reads, and maybe on a website that people don't usually go to. And then there's a vote 72 hours later, and it's too late for folks to do anything about it. So that's one thing we'll be focusing on here at the foundation in the coming legislative session. All that being said, now we've got some time for a Q&A from the audience. We've got a microphone right over here. So if somebody, I saw a hand over here somewhere. Yes, if you'd like to ask a question.
Yeah, one of the issues with whenever you bring up renewables has to do with the counter is always fossil fuel, okay? Well, about 40 or 50 years ago, and I don't know where I read it, it was either the back of Oil and Gas or something like that. You know, there was two schools of thought having to do with fossil fuel, okay, or fuels, okay, that the Soviets had. One was that it was like the Western concept, it was a bunch of old dead stuff that rotted. That was oil and gas, that's fossil fuel, okay. The other was it's a natural process of Earth, which is called the biogenics hypothesis. Anderson, many years ago, who was head of Atlantic Richfield, believed that it was a natural process of Earth. Okay. My question is, why is it called fossil fuel?
Well, I guess you know, there is evidence that some methagenic bacteria and so on will produce methane from other organic matter, but you know, I think the majority view in geological circles is that most of the fossil fuel that we have came from organic matter that was formerly life, either plant life or animal life or sea life, which was then turned into oil and gas and coal over many millions of years through heat and pressure and so forth. I mean, I think that there's some evidence of you know, methane and so on being produced in the mantle and so forth. But from a point of view of what we're talking about, running out of fossil fuels and all that sort of thing, the rate of production, you know, from any process like that is trivial compared with the rate at which we're going to use it. So for all practical purposes, it doesn't really matter whether it was being made, more is being made through some kind of process. The question is, how fast are you using it? How fast, if it is being produced, how fast is it being produced? And so for just being practical about it, it doesn't really matter, but that's why it's called fossil fuel.
All right, another question?
Thank you, Bill. I'm Brad Shields, and the representative, I am a lobbyist, but I don't represent anybody in the energy field, both renewable or non. But my question is, Bill, your comments have been in the past that renewable energy be good, subsidies bad. But your videos today and every single panelist, with the exception of Senator Campbell, were pretty convincing that you all don't like renewable energy. I mean, nobody even mentioned subsidies in the first part of this conference until Senator Campbell brought them up. So if the point is that you're opposed to subsidies, and as your point was, you're opposed to all subsidies, will the TPPF be opposed to the renewing of the Chapter 313 agreements next session, or just some of the 313 agreements?
Thank you, Brad. We've been working on 313 and 312 and lots of other subsidies for a long time here at the foundation. Otherwise known as corporate welfare is the term that we use, and the evidence is just extraordinarily tilted towards the best way to create jobs and to grow an economy and to help people flourish is through markets, right? And markets, of course, get sort of a bad rap, the market capitalism, those kind of things. But all markets are people buying and selling and trading and making agreements, and that's proven. What we call the Texas model here in Texas. Texas has really, since we, Texas really took off after 2003 when the country was going through some significant severe crisis, and a lot of states decided they were having budget deficits and they all raised taxes. Texas didn't, right? We held the line and we kept it, and then all of a sudden Texas recovered and it hasn't looked back since because we've held the fiscal line. So that's the way to do it. In the foundation, we've put out lots of information on this. We've got a guide to corporate welfare, and in all those situations, we stand against any type of corporate welfare. We want markets to happen, and that includes 312 and 313.
Can I just clarify too? I mean, I wasn't saying I was negative on renewable energy. The point of my comments was to say, why is it around the world where you have mandated and subsidised renewable energy, it ends up driving up electricity prices? I was just trying to explain why that's the case. It was a factual kind of analysis that I was trying to give you, and it's a fact. Wherever these mandates and so on have been put in, the price of electricity has been driven up, and there's a good reason. I was trying to explain there are a number of very cogent reasons why that's the case.
Yeah, okay.
I'd like to hear a comment on electric vehicles. If we get a significant portion of the market, either through mandate or otherwise, is electric vehicles, and we have more and more states do what California did the other day, where they're requiring 60%, I think it is, by 2030 and 100% by 60 of their electricity being all renewables. We're headed towards a major catastrophe, both in electric cost and electric grid reliability.
I'll just say one thing about that. I'm not voting for anything that mandates you have to have an electric car.
Mm-hmm. One comment I would make is, so I just came back from Western Australia, where there's a big boom on, where all the major mining companies are all running over Australia looking for deposits of lithium, nickel, cobalt and so forth, all the metals that go into batteries. They think it's going to be a fantastic bonanza for them, but if it's going to be a fantastic bonanza for them, guess what that means? It means the price of all those materials are going to go through the roof. These aren't going to be very cheap. I mean, the implicit assumption here is that you could massively expand the number of batteries. Where's all the material going to come from to make all of those batteries? And you're talking about a fantastic increase in the amount of nickel, cobalt, and so forth that you would need. This is totally unrealistic, I'm afraid.
Just to add to your comment, it's sometimes, and I think I mentioned that in my comments, but to get a hold of scale.
Yeah.
Something that can, quite viable in a smaller size. Energy analyst, I respect very much, Mark Mills, I bet you know him, calculated if you took the entire electricity produced by one gigafactory, which is huge. He says he's going to build them even bigger and bigger. But just take that, for how long would that meet the total demand? And it was 5 minutes. For total, I mean, it's kind of an odd metric, but total electric demand would be met by 5 minutes. I mean, that's the scale issue.
Right. Related to that is, I mean, people don't realise, we've had now a number of decades of mandates and subsidies for renewable energy. The percentage of the world's primary energy supply that comes from wind and solar is still less than 4%. Despite all of the massive subsidies and so on, mandates and so on, it's minuscule. You draw a graph of the world's energy use, there's a little tiny sliver at the top, which is coming from wind and solar, despite all of these massive efforts of Western governments to promote these energy sources.
And we might, not be terrified if our electric bills went up a little bit. But, there's about 7.6 billion human beings on the planet. I think that's the population. Overwhelming majority, we're 320-some million in this country. There's the majority of humanity does not have access to, current energies, electricity, basic electricity. Right. Which is absolutely necessary. And, in the 20th century, we had the agricultural revolution and successfully increased agricultural productivity so that it could, in fact, meet the demand of a population then thought that would enter famine. But I think there's, to me, a very compelling ethic that should be part of all these discussions about renewables and fossil fuels and all
I think
those
it's
things.
if you want to say something about ethics, billions of people don't have access to electricity. Electricity is really the essence of a modern lifestyle. These people want to get access to modern energy sources. They want to get the cheapest available energy source. And who are we to deny these people the right to develop economically? I mean, I think it's a really compelling ethical argument.
Hi. I support renewable energy subsidies, but I genuinely appreciate having my thinking expanded around that. So I'm wondering if you accept the concern of climate researchers that burning fossil fuels is changing the climate, and part of what they are telling us is that with climate change, we're not going to get more hurricanes, but they're going to be wetter and stronger. And Harvey alone cost us, $115 billion, and now with Florence coming on. So I say that as a way of suggesting that those are some more implicit subsidies to fossil fuel companies. But I'd love to hear you thinking about that. Thank you.
You were talking about that earlier.
Yeah, number of interesting points there. I mean, first of all, climate has changed and always will change. Climate changes all the time. I mean, it's only about 12,000 years ago we had the ice ages, right? Last ice age. So the really significant question is, so there's what we'd call natural climate change, and then there are influences that people have on climate change. The really critical question is how much is natural and how much is human influenced. And that is, a very difficult question to answer. I don't think it's correct to say that there's any really scientific consensus on what proportion of climate change is natural versus what proportion is human influenced. And in terms of extreme weather events and so forth, if you actually look at the evidence, there is no evidence to date that anything we've experienced in any country is outside the range of natural climate variation. It's not a fact to say that hurricanes have gotten worse in the United States. It's not a fact to say tornadoes have got worse. It's just not true if you actually look at the evidence. A lot of what you see and people talking about the effects of climate change comes from climate models. It's forecasts. It's not based on actual observation of data of what's occurred. It's based on forecasts from models. And there's very strong evidence that the forecasts from the models they're overestimating the degree of warming from carbon dioxide emissions, at least by a factor of 2. There's only one model, turns out, climate model that's tracked the actual data on temperature measurements, which is turns out it's the Russian model. If you look at the Russian model, its projections, the business as usual emission of carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels will not have any measurable impact on our temperatures. It'll be fractions of a degree. So I think the certainty surrounding this issue has been way oversold. And what I would say is, we should just sort of take a few breaths and so forth, and let's wait for a bit more evidence to come in before we go down the road of spending a whole bunch of resources on this issue.
And I would add, and I think I'm just repeating myself from my first comments, according to the federal number crunchers, the U.S. is reducing CO2 emissions and the carbon intensity of our economy more than any other nation, like UK, like Australia, like Germany, who have major, mandates to do so. We're doing something right, and that the United States, our economy has always been gifted with efficiency.
Well, it's also it's a market at work,
Yeah.
actually. It's natural gas displacing coal.
But
Yeah, it turns out that markets are good not just for building an economy and helping humans flourish, but it's good for implementing environmental policy too. Because, clearly over the years, people have been concerned about CO2 emissions, and the market has responded to that in the United States without any regulations on the way, unlike the countries that do have regulations that aren't producing.
Thank you. Okay. Well, I'm Rusty Wallace. I'm a director with Devils River Conservancy and owner-operator of Frontier Development. And I've got a kind of a two-part question I'd like to ask Senator Campbell, if you could. One of my concerns is why a few moments ago you said the producers of wind farm electricity, why are they exempt from the normal public notice requirements or the 72 hours? How did they get written into the legislation?
I think that's a great question. I wrote it down because I think it needs to be addressed. I think there needs to be open meetings about it. I didn't know until this, so I've learned from here.
I don't understand why.
It happened before I was in, and I think it needs to be addressed. I don't understand why either.
Okay, well, that being said, you mentioned some zoning of the bases, 25-mile barriers. Why couldn't we, and we know the impacts, obviously y'all do on the panel, why couldn't the legislature, knowing the impacts, I'm not saying whether I'm pro or anti-subsidy or renewable energy, but knowing the impacts, why not establish a zoning method for the state of Texas to save some of these places that are energy conscious or job creators, or even some of the last great places that our state has, such as in the wilderness areas of the Devil's River Basin being one that's suffering the consequences right now, the encroachment of wind farms around the state's last, what I call pristine river, and that drainage. Is there a way to do that? And isn't this argument more about greenhouse gases versus clean energy and what we as a nation, state, or individual are willing to pull out of our pocket and invest? To me, that's what this is all about.
Well, let me answer the question that I think you're asking me, and that is, can we as a state just say, you can't put them here, you can put them here, kind of a thing?
Yeah, I'm a
Zone where you can put them. Is that right?
Zoning.
Okay. Well, first of all, it was very, very difficult to get past 25 nautical miles, that you can't have a wind turbine within 25 nautical miles. That was very hard, and that's looking at protecting our bases, protecting the mission of our aviation bases. So that was very hard. That industry has very strong lobby. And that, the way they are so persuasive, and sometimes I think I've got all, that I wish I could just pass something with my one vote. But it takes a majority. It takes the numbers. And what I think is good policy, I've got to have in the Senate right now, most certainly 19 of us have to agree on that. So a couple of things. One, no, don't think that's gonna happen. I don't think that a bill can go forward. Now, there may be some tweaking that can be done, like X number of miles around a natural, one of our parks, something like that. But you run into the will of the people meaning private property owners. You run into issues of, well, that's your private property, but it's affecting me on this side of the fence. Those are hard issues to address. I mean, if it's not a wind farm, it's a quarry. I live on top of rock, and I live next to a quarry. I realize I'm just chasing a rabbit, and I'm gonna get off of this. But the point is, it's private property, and they can do what legally says they can do. We can't go in and, we don't want to zone the whole state and have a county be able to zone. We need freedom out there. People need their liberties. And you don't want to pass legislation that takes away people's liberties, but you sure don't want to promote legislation that gives a subsidy or an advantage to a company that doesn't in turn help the majority of the people. Did I answer your question?
Fairly well.
Thank you.
Actually, I have a question on this, raising this point about, well, I mean, I don't know, this is more or less like a question that I have, but something that really concerned me, I've been a bird watcher from a long time when I was a kid, and something that really concerned me about talk of putting wind turbines along the Texas coast is, you're in the flight path for migratory birds. You have all these birds flying back across the Gulf of Mexico. They've got to run the gauntlet of a bunch of wind turbines. It kind of concerns me what that might do to bird life.
Well, I sure wish we would get the bird watching group and those that, to get on board with that. I mean, let's try to get, the pieces that we can.
I think they have in some other states, and to that question, I was struck, this may not still be in effect in the new administration, but in the Fish and Wildlife Service granted an exemption for takes, killing of, I believe it was 30 bald or gold eagles a year, an exemption, which I don't, and that's probably, one doesn't want to be ultra dramatic, but not that exemption was not available to other.
There's another implicit subsidy.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, I think, and we'll have to end here, but I think the bottom line, as we heard from one of the residents of Comanche up there, is that if it weren't for the subsidies, none of these wind turbines or solar plants, for that matter, would be being built. And unfortunately, a lot of those subsidies are coming from the federal government, and that's a problem. But I think if the Texas PUC and the folks who at ERCOT who manage the grid here would force wind and solar to pay for the true cost of they impose on the grid, and particularly because of the federal tax subsidy, people would stop building here, and if we take away some of these local subsidies, a lot of people would not build here as well. And I think that would solve the problem rather than trying to regulate land use, because from our perspective, if you start regulating wind turbines, the next thing you're going to do is regulate barns, and we don't want to go there at the foundation. So thank you all very much for being here. Thank you for panelists, and would you please join me in thanking our panelists one more time.
You bet.
Do I have a card, John? Do I have a